Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, party people. I am coming to you from Siglufjörður. It is a tiny fishing village. We used to be a fishing village up in northern Iceland. You might have heard of the Icelandic clothing brand 66 Degrees North, which is about pretty close to the Arctic Circle, is what it refers to latitude. This is up above 66 degrees north. Really charming little place. We just fell in love with it. And so I'm going to do an office hours up here. It is, it's funny to show you the time. It's 5:34 in the morning. And it's, you know, of course, here in Iceland in the summer, it's light all the time. So my wife isn't awake yet, so I can do office hours questions. And I've got your questions here on PollGab, so I'll go ahead and start going through those. If you want to get questions in for the next office hours, hit the link in the description and you can go cast your questions and vote on which ones that I answer. Now for this one, I noticed that there's a wide variety of questions. Some of them are technical, some of them are professional development. For this one, for the next half hour, hour or so, I'm going to focus on the highly voted technical questions. And then I'll come back and do another one with the highly voted like soft skills ones or life, travel, whatever. So the highest voted one was, "Hi Brent, we have a database that's 1 terabyte in size. We have no index maintenance jobs running there. Are the auto update of statistics sufficient? We've done this because we have database mirroring and the secondary replica cannot catch up. Plus, disk space is an issue since we need to do it online." So, one of the things that I know a lot of people really struggle with is, am I doing enough maintenance? Am I doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing for database maintenance? Because for a long time you heard that index maintenance was really important. The idea behind index maintenance involves a couple of different concepts on fragmentation. But you know what? Like 70, 80, 90% of the shops that I see, they don't really need index rebuild jobs. And those index rebuild jobs are so intensive every night that it causes them problems. Here's what I would do though. I get a little nervous when you say you never do it at all, that you never do index maintenance at all because the secondary can't keep up. What I would do is I would break that work up across multiple weeks. Ola Hollengren's maintenance scripts have a time threshold option. They have an option that'll say don't do index rebuilds more than this, like longer than this. Don't do or leave. They have another option. He has another option that will let you set how much time it waits in between each index rebuild, which kind of gives your availability group some time to catch up. So what I would say is start playing around with some of the settings and try rebuilding or reorganizing small portion or small numbers of indexes every weekend, just on weekends, give yourself some time. Because I worry that maybe you've gone for years and some of the objects really do have problems. The other thing I would say is whenever you're trying to fix a performance problem, look at your weight stats. Look at what your top weight stats are. And if it's page IO latch, for example, page IO latch means reading data pages from a data file. If it's page IO latch, that means that your storage bottlenecked. There are cases where defragmenting can help that. Not because you're getting the pages in order, but because you're really effectively increasing fill factor. You're jamming more juicy data into each AK page. All right, so there's that one. Next up, we have, so G Surgeon asks, and I forgot to say who asked that last one. G Surgeon asked, now dang it, it moved over to a place on my phone where I can't see it. Is it a bad practice to have multiple SQL Server instances on a virtual server? And on a server, so two parts. The first one is it a bad practice to have multiple SQL Server instances on a virtual server? For me, yes. Because here's the deal. I want to set you up for success. I don't want to set you up for failure. I want to set you up for success. And the more likely it is that you'll succeed, the better. So I tend to try to give people easy buttons wherever I can. When you put multiple instances of SQL Server on the same Windows OS, doesn't matter whether it's a VM or physical, you just make your troubleshooting harder. Because when you're having CPU issues, when you're having storage throughput issues, when you're having noisy neighbor issues, now you have to figure out, is it something where I'm actually using all of the resources available, or is it an issue where another instance is robbing me of performance throughput? Which is especially tricky with CPU and storage throughput. This is especially for me the case with virtual machines, because odds are you're licensing at the VM host level anyway, so why not just separate each SQL Server instance onto its own Windows instance? Just that way it makes your performance tuning easier. And the other thing that's big for me is making your Windows patch management easier. If I've got I love how you'll get birds rolling through here all morning. If I've got half a dozen SQL Server instances sharing the same Windows, that makes patch management a real pain in the rear, because you have to get all 6 customers, or all 6 internal clients, to all agree on the time when you're going to reboot Windows and when you're going to patch Windows, and that can be a giant pain in the rear. The second part of that was, on a server with multiple instances, does the OS need more RAM than it would need with only one instance? Not as far as I'm aware of. Usually the biggest problem is just SQL Server's RAM. All right, next up, Avi asks, why do we not have a good static code analyzer for SQL code? Is it just not as significant in the case of SQL as it is other programming languages? So part of the challenge with analyzing SQL is that SQL can call other SQL on other servers. So like you can have code that's calling across a linked server, that's calling across a database that isn't part of your project. Cross-database work is extremely common. You can have dynamic SQL, which is T-SQL that builds other T-SQL. You can have T-SQL that calls triggers, that you don't even know about, that you just need to be aware of. So I think it's just how the SQL language has the ability to call code that isn't part of the same project that you have, that you may not even have access to, or things that change dynamically at runtime. I have seen vendors ship code that just scans through, or static code analyzer that rips through your T-SQL and tries to flag things, but generally just does a terrible job. The other thing is, I think there's not demand. I think that most people wouldn't pay money for something like that. Wouldn't pay money to have their code analyzed. I think most people, it's the same problem that you have with any project, good, fast, and cheap, pick any two. People want to ship their code as quickly as possible. And I think that there's also an assumption that database code performance doesn't matter until it's too late. That when you're in the beginning in development database sizes, the database is small, the amount of work that you're doing is small. So even if you're doing rebar code, as Jeff Moden would say, processing data row by agonizing row, you just don't notice the overhead at small sizes. So when the static code analyzer flags a problem and says, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, people are like, well, I don't understand what the big deal is. The code runs perfectly fine. So that makes it more challenging. I will say, as a side note, though, I'm always amazed at how much Microsoft SQL Server costs, and at the same time, how little people are willing to spend on tooling. That you'll see people working around a SQL Server licensed with $500,000 worth of SQL Server licensing, and they won't even have a monitoring product on it. They're like, oh, $2,000 for monitoring, who could possibly afford that? In the meanwhile, they're working on a $500,000 SQL Server, which I just find funny. If you had a $500,000 Ferrari, you wouldn't be saying, well, we need to save on dashboard. We're not going to have any speedometer to know how fast we're going. We're just going to assume that it's fast. Well, sure, it's going to be if you drive it correctly, but odds are you're not driving it correctly. All right, let's see what we got next. Next one, Kyle says, we have an ETL For those of you who haven't heard that before, that's extract, transform, and load, which is how it's part of one of the ways that you can move data from one place to another. An ETL SQL Server with 780 gigabytes of RAM. On random days during loads, it logs insufficient system memory and resource pool default to run this query. Plus, we get a non-yielding worker scheduler, we get, the way he's phrased it, it's basically he's getting non-yielding scheduler messages in the error logs. Indirect checkpoints helped. I'm surprised, actually. Thoughts on where to look next. Oh, that's interesting. Where I would look next. Okay, so there are a couple different things. The worker non-yielding on scheduler, that reeks of a SQL Server bug. So the very first thing that I look at is patching to the most current patch level. Very often in 2012, 2014, 2016, there were patches that addressed non-yielding schedulers. I don't see that as much in 2017, 2019. I'm not saying it never happened. It just doesn't ring a bell as often as 2012, 2014, 2016. It was like, ring my bell. It was happening continuously. Oh, did you get lucky? I'm not sure if you got a fish. So that would be the first place that I would go and look. In terms of non-yielding schedulers, that shouldn't be related to code unless you're doing something really weird, like you're trying to call CLR code in a weird way. The other thing that kind of mystifies me is when you say ETL SQL Server, I wonder if you're running SSIS on the same box where you're running SQL Server, especially when you said insufficient memory and resource pool default. So the reason why I would say that is people will say, well, I've got this SQL Server and I've got integration services and they're both installed on the same box. Can't they collaborate and stop, cooperate, and listen? That's SQL Server doesn't cross-communicate between like integration services and the engine. Those are totally separate applications. They just happen to have the same brand name in them. It's not like they're cooperating somehow. So one of the things that I would do is I would check to see what does your memory look like for SSIS at the same time that you're running your ETL loads. Because what I've seen happen is people will run big, huge ETL packages that try to move all kinds of data through RAM. SSIS fires up, grabs all kinds of RAM. That puts SQL Server, the engine, the database engine, under pressure. It has to, has to back down the amount of memory that it uses, and that's when you start to see problems around insufficient memory. Generally, especially when you talk about the kind of metal that you're dealing with there, 780 gigabytes of RAM, that's when I'd start to say, let's keep them separated. Let's go put SSIS on its own VM so that we can manage memory independently there, and then put whatever database engine that it's using on a separate VM. Because odds are that the database engine probably doesn't need 780 gigs of RAM, and neither does SSIS. It's going to be a matter of finding the line in the middle. Period. Hi, guys. A couple of noisy little birds here. When I first pulled up and I parked the car, immediately I had like a dozen birds all come in when I got out of the car, because I think they all assumed that I was here to feed the birds. And I was like, oh, I got some bad news for you. All I got is coffee and Haribo gummy bears, and I'm not about to put gummy bears into a bird and then go see what happens. I'm past that age. I probably would have done it when I was younger, but I'm past that age now. Let's see here. C. Pearson says, this question is on documentation. When it comes to reviewing a client's documentation, I must be misreading this. A client's what? Client's what? Client's documentation in reference to their data systems, environments, etc. What are the top 5 or more things that you feel all companies should be documenting, and what are the things that you wish were documented or tracked? Okay, have I said, I think I've probably said here's the deal a bunch inside here. Okay, so let me think about how I want to phrase this diplomatically. I would be utterly stunned if a client handed me accurate, up-to-date documentation. I'd be stunned. I'd be flabbergasted. You'd have to pick me up off the floor. What I have had happen is I've had people give me 30 pages of documentation and say, all right, read through this and then we'll talk through it. and I start looking at the documentation, and it's clear from the documentation that it's wildly outdated, that it's totally it's useless. And I'm like, set this aside. Tell me what the problem is. Tell me what you're hiring me for. Tell me what you're complaining about. Most of the time when people think that they need to be documenting things, they think they want to document their table structures and their ERDs and how servers are related to each other. But that stuff's all out of date and they don't understand it. So I kind of like to think of it as, who are you writing this for? Who's the customer of your documentation? And what do they need to know quickly? Write that part down. Like, if you imagine that you're going to sketch out this whole data model and you're going to show the relationships between every table or between every server, imagine who's going to consume that. Like, are you going to have someone walk in on their first day and read all that and then go, oh yeah, now I think I get it? What I would do, if you think that you want to hand documentation that shows relationships to a new hire, is don't document. I'm not saying don't document. Everybody should go document. Good luck. Nobody does that. But instead, pick out the handful pieces of code. Pick out like 5 stored procedures and go, if you can wrap your head around these 5 stored procedures, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what our business does. Let's say that it's an e-commerce shop. Add an item to a cart. Start the checkout process, start the shipping process, check to see if an item is in stock. Like the basic core stored procedures that are called a lot and that matter a lot. That really goes a pretty long way. Otherwise, when I walk into different industries all the time, I walk into different verticals all the time, and everybody's shopping carts are the same. Everybody's membership sites are the same. Everybody's back end for accounting system is basically the same. The tables are just named slightly differently. Or in the case of SAP, crazy differently. But it's not, I don't think I've ever had a case where I went, oh, documentation is amazing here, this saved my life. What's much more convenient is having access to people at the company who can explain things quickly. That for me is much more valuable. What I would say, though, is in terms of documentation, what I always loved as a database administrator for documentation is when the poop hits the fan and I need to fail over a data center or there's something large that I need to fail over from one place to another, document the steps of that and test them. Like if you hand me a document for failing over the data warehouse and it hasn't been updated or tested in the last 3 years, listen, I get it. If it hasn't been documented or tested in the last 3 years, then clearly it's not going to work. And then I'm going to get all kinds of crazy error messages when I go to fail over anyway. So, boy, they are really loud. I don't know if y'all can hear those. I would assume that you can hear them. I haven't really, so obviously I should have said right at the beginning, oh, I'm going to regret not saying this. So that's the end of that question. I'm going to regret not saying this at the beginning of the webcast, but I should have said I didn't bring all my hi-fi audio gear with me as we go through touring different parts of Iceland. I leave all that in my home studio back in Reykjavik. But all I have is like a fuzzy cat, or they call them like dead cat microphones on top of my camera. And I don't have like my lapel Britney microphone and all that kind of thing. All right, because somebody's going to complain on YouTube, because it's YouTube and it's free. Nobody ever says, thank you for sharing your knowledge here for free on YouTube. No, what they say is, your audio doesn't sound good. Can you please bring a home studio with you while you travel and do these things for free? Goofballs. All right, next up, let's see here. Oh, G-Surgeon has a second question, too. G-Surgeon asks, I recently had a serious performance issue when statistics were updated with a sample of just a few percentage. Oh, I love it. I'd like to disable auto updates, so that question is fantastic. I want to stop there and give a little brief background. If those of you who didn't understand the context of that question, like why it's so terrible when SQL Server does update stats and auto sample with a really small percentage of rows, on our YouTube channel, check out the statistics class. There's a whole like 15-part series done by Doug Lane explaining how SQL Server statistics work and why they're so why they can affect query performance so much. G-Surgeon says, I'd like to disable auto-update statistics for a few specific statistics using update stats with full scan, no recompute. Is this a viable idea, or is it shooting, or am I shooting myself in my own foot? I love that, and I don't talk about it in any of the classes. The reason I don't talk about it in any of the classes is that I think for most people it is shooting themselves in their foot. Because of the parameter sniffing issue. Most people, G-Surgeon is not in this, I'm going to sneeze any moment now. Most people, G-Surgeon is not in this category, but most people run into performance issues and they type update statistics, they get fresh stats, they blow the plan cache, and then they get a new query plan due to parameter sniffing. And they don't understand those intricacies that I just talked through there in the span of like 10 seconds and that takes like an hour to do a training session on. G-Surgeon, for yours, yes, I'm fine with it. Once you understand the mechanics of parameter sniffing, clearing the plan cache, how update statistics relates to that, and how sampling can be the cause of a bad plan, not the contents of the table themselves or the parameters that are getting used, then I'm totally okay with it. But I feel like to really do justice to that, if I was to put together a training class on it, it would take like a day of walkthrough explanations to get to the point where you're at. And there would be like 10 people in the world who would get, not 10 people in the world, but you know, like 1% of all database administrators out there would get it. So I'm okay with you doing it, G-Surgeon. Next up we have, let's see here, and we'll do this, I haven't looked to see how long this thing's been running. This could have been, we'll do one more question, then we'll stop there. My friend is a one-man IT, my friend is, so Carrie asks, my friend, nicely done, is a one-man IT department at a small business. Though he loves learning all that he can about performance tuning and SQL Server in general, he's curious if it's the best return for his efforts. How small is too small to worry about performance tuning? If users aren't complaining about it, I would move on to something else. So what I'll usually do, my recipe for career success, says the guy sitting in Iceland running his own company. My recipe for career success would be go to the person who has the biggest influence over your paycheck. Sometimes that's the person who signs your check, sometimes that's the manager, sometimes it's a person with a lot of influence in the company. Go to the person with the most influence over your paycheck and ask them what their biggest issue in IT is. Like, what's the thing that frustrates you the most about our IT? Or what's the barrier in our IT that's stopping the rest of the company from making more money or saving more money? And then focus on that. Because there are going to be plenty of times in your career where it's something that you never would have expected, that it's something completely different. There was one point in my career, for example, I was a database administrator, and we were just beginning to implement one new brand of servers and a new kind of virtualization at the office. And I asked that of my manager. I said, what's the biggest bottleneck, or what's your biggest problem with IT right now? And he said, we've got this new brand of server and this new kind of virtualization, and nobody can seem to figure out how to make it perform well. You know, that I would love to move over to it, but it performs like a dog. Every time that we move a server onto it, our end users yell and scream. He's like, nobody at the vendor can seem to figure it out. I need somebody to figure that thing out. And I was a database administrator. It didn't really have anything to do with me, but I was like, I love learning. I would like to make more money. This is an avenue to make more money. and so I should put a disclaimer in there. Part of your job too is to understand who does have the most influence over your salary and long-term well-being at a company. And it's not always the noisy users. It's not always the people who complain the most. So that's why I started this by saying kind of it's about end user complaints, and then I walked that back and said it's also about the people who can have the most influence over your career. All right, so we've been talking for a while. The birds have certainly been talking for a while. So I will stop here. I will go refuel my coffee. I'll go pick another filming location. Because this little area is just absolutely gorgeous. We're at a fjord here in North Iceland. This is the ocean here. I'm actually kind of surprised that we haven't seen more fishing boats take off. This is the kind of pleasure port over here. The ocean fishing port, I'll grab the camera, over here. So yeah, so the ocean fishing port is over there. I'm kind of surprised that we haven't had more noise from fishing boats taking off this morning. But I'll go drive around here, find another location, then we'll go through the soft skills part in the next video, the questions that y'all had about professional development type stuff. So I will see y'all in a while. I'm going to try and just hit stop and record on this. I'm not even going to do any editing. I'm not going to do any post-production. I'm not going to clean the audio up. Whatever it is, because whenever my wife wakes up, we're going out for breakfast, and then we're going out sightseeing again. I say that, but I do know that. We are going sightseeing again. So I'll see y'all in a while.